welcome. I am DEJI360. Nigeria's anti-graft agency, the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, EFCC, is under the spotlight as 16 state governments are challenging the constitutionality of the laws establishing it and other anti-corruption agencies like the ICPC. Now, the country's Supreme Court has now fixed October the 22nd for the hearing of the suit. The case was originally filed by Kogi State government, but 15 other states have since joined the suit as co-plaintiffs now. The states that joined in the suit include Ondo, Edo, Oyo, Ogun, Nasarawa, Kebbi, Katsina, Sokoto, Jigawa, Enugu, Benue, Anambra, Plateau, Cross River, and Niger states. The 16 state governors cited a precedent in which the Supreme Court held that the EFCC Establishment Act emanated from a United Nations Convention Against Corruption without following the provision of Section 12 of the amended 1999 Constitution. According to the governors, any agency of the federal government cannot investigate, obtain records, invite or arrest anyone concerning offenses arising from the administration and management of funds belonging to the state. They contend that as states, they have functional houses of assembly, but that the impute of these houses was never sought in the course of the enactment of the EFCC Act as required by the 1999 Constitution as amended. Now, EFCC was established by an act of the National Assembly in 2003, actually, by the administration of former President Olusegun Obasanjo in swift response now to the pressure from the Financial Action Task Force on money laundering. A coalition of civil society organizations has actually asked the Supreme Court to dismiss the lawsuit filed by the governor, saying that it threatens accountability and the fight against corruption. So let's discuss this further. Adewale Ajadi, who is a lawyer and public affairs analyst, joins me on the program. And I also have Fred Nzako, who is also a legal practitioner. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming on the program. Let me start with you, Mr. Ajadi. Could this... What do you make of this? Just help us to give us your thoughts on this.
Well, thank you for inviting me. My own sense is that this is part of a democracy. Inevitably, rules will be challenged and efforts will be made for different institutions to establish the bona fides before the law. My own concern, however, is one that the governors who have supported this are sending a signal to the wider country that they do not want to be accountable, because I don't see how they would imagine that a commitment of the federal government to making people accountable is something that they should challenge. But anyway, let's look at that. This is a different perspective. There's some very important points to make out is that the Constitution is clear. I think it's Section 14.2 that says that the federal government is set up for the I think well-being of Nigerians, something to that effect. I can't say it off the top of my head. And essentially, on welfare of Nigerians. And essentially, it can be argued that corruption is some of the things that damage the welfare of Nigerians, and the overwhelming responsibility of the government to do that. The second thing is that the state governments have not also supported the federal government's effort to make their legislatures independent, to make local governments independent, to make the judiciary of the states independent, at least financially independent, so that they can be accountable in the states. So there is that second element. So this means that it seems that these are not good faith interventions, but protection of current executives who might feel themselves to be accountable to the EFCC. The question is, has the EFCC been effective in holding them to account? I would say that's to a level, but it has not been as effective as it could be if the state governments add constitutions and add institutions that are independent of the executive to the point that the executive is accountable within their states. So, I mean, intellectually, they have some interesting arguments that could carry the day. But the fundamentals is that it undermines the socio-political and socio-economic development of Nigeria for the state governments not to be accountable, because they're already imperial and impervious to any systems that holds them to account. And they seem to get away with anything they can. And I think it will be to our detriment, fundamentally. But of course, this thing is still before the Supreme Court. I can't pronounce on what they're going to say. But it will be to our detriment if such a decision was made, that the EFCC could not hold them to account, because it's limited accountability.
Mr. Nzeko, let me ask you this. Look, if this had been the creation of the EFCC now, if it had been subjected to, say, a constitutional amendment and had gone through the process of, the process of amending the constitution, or the constitutional process now of getting, for instance, the state assemblies to approve and all of that, where you would, of course, need to get 2/3 of the state assemblies to approve. Do you think the EFCC, the government back then in 2003 would have succeeded in creating the EFCC? Considering the influence that some of these state governors have over their state houses of assembly.
Let me say emphatically that I belong to the school of thought that want respect for constitutionalism, because we operate constitutional democracy. And there is no need to cut corners when we know exactly what to do. The EFCC is a creation of the Constitution, and any agency, organ of government that is a creation of the Constitution must follow the duly laid down procedure of its establishment. And let me also say emphatically that it is never too late to turn around, to make a detour when you observe or realize that you are moving on the wrong track. EFCC has been alive for almost 20 years since its establishment, but what it now means is that it has been running on the wrong track, and it is never too late to change the direction and move on the right track. So nobody should bring up the argument that EFCC is there and can continue to be there. Yes, it can continue to be there to serve the interest of the federal government, but if it does not have the concurrent legislative input of the state houses of assembly, then it should at best be a federal agency that should have nothing to do with the federating state, because it is clearly enshrined in our constitution how a foreign treaty can be domesticated, how a foreign convention can be domesticated. And if for any reason the EFCC and other agencies of government like ICPC fall short of the provisions of the Constitution, it is not wrong. It is not too late to right the wrong. The government has two options. One, to limit EFCC operations to federal government interests, or bring the concurrence of the state. The law did not say two-thirds majority. The law says majority of the states. The fact of two-thirds may be understood by other provisions, but what Section 12 of the Constitution says is that majority of the states. We have 36 states in Nigeria. Half of the 36 is 18. Simple majority is 19 against 17. So if 19 states houses of assembly endorse and confirm EFCC establishment following the endorsement and confirmation by National Assembly, it can now be taken to the president for accent. And I think that is what the Supreme Court is to judge. And when the Supreme Court decides one way or the other, the rest is left for the executive to implement.
Now, help me understand this. The EFCC is also a creation of the parliament. Doesn't that make it a legal body that should be so recognized and have the powers to perform its duties? Because it's a creation of parliament anyway.
Any law created by the parliament, the Constitution is very clear on that. Any act, any law made by the parliament that runs contrary to the provisions of the Constitution, such law or such act will become invalid to the extent of its inconsistency. So, EFCC Act, Establishment Act, being a creation of the Parliament, which has run foul of the provision of the Constitution, will become invalid to the extent of its inconsistency. And we realize that inconsistency, lack of recognition of the provisions of Section 12 of our Constitution, which clearly stipulated how international treaties or conventions can be domesticated. It is very clear and very simple. So, and that's why I say that it is left for government, it's left for Parliament to do what is right by ensuring that there is a concurrence in the establishment of EFCC by the states, the federating states. Otherwise, EFCC will have nothing to do with the states or local governments, but can only limit itself to the federal government interests.
Sijati, do you think, if I'm not in any way preempting what the Supreme Court is going to say on this, but you know, should we have a situation where you know, that requirement is made that this has to go through the state houses of assembly, 36? Don't you think that might don't you think that might just be the end of the EFCC as it is today?
I think that we are moving deck chairs around on the Titanic. You know, the reality is that Nigeria is got serious problems with corruption. What the elite in Nigeria have consistently done is neuter any attempt to make them accountable. The Constitution is to serve for the welfare of Nigerians. That's the primary purpose of the Constitution. My own position is that as this goes before the Senate, before the Supreme Court, we most certainly must make sure that states recognize that they are there for the welfare of Nigerians, not for the personal aggrandizement of governments. And that what we should be fighting for, rather than debating what the court's going to decide fundamentally, which they are going to decide any which way, is that every state should have a constitution. That the state governors should be constitutionally accountable within their states. And by doing that, then we put in place the solutions of an independent body, because nevertheless, whatever we're arguing about, EFCC is not effective in holding states to account. They don't have access to the Accountant General's office in the states, and they don't have corporations of the Attorney Generals to prosecute state governments. So in real terms, it's only marginal effectiveness in the state level. What is going to make them extremely effective is to have state bodies who can hold state governments into account. And that means that we should have state constitutions. That means that governors are accountable, and that the executive arm, the legislative arm, and the judicial arm of states are able to act effectively. These are not abstracts in our constitutional practices. It is fundamental. The divisions of power are fundamental to our constitutional ability. So those things should be passed down to the states. How do we talk about federating bodies who themselves are not consistent with the federal system of accountability, when they're not? When decisions are made at the Supreme Court to make sure that they are accountable for funds allocated to them, they are not accountable. Chief executives who had immunity, when they lose immunity, refuse to submit themselves to law enforcement bodies. All of these things are happening. So we're on a slippery slope anyway. Whatever anybody says, if we do not make sure that states become accountable, I don't think Nigeria is going to be governable in the long term. Because then a state government can decide whatever they want, and people from outside the states can never hold them to account. Very dangerous system.
Let me come, Stanzako. Do you, in all fairness, think states can actually set up their own institutions that can fight corruption and check misappropriation, check the executive, so to speak? You see the way the various state houses of assemblies are being controlled by the governors. And as we speak today, I think with the exception of Kano State, or probably one or two other states, I don't think there's any other state that has set up its own anti-graft agency at all. And you look at the way this case came up. Some people have said, you look at it emanating from Kogi State, that at the end of the day, this whole thing ties down to the issue of the former governor of that state, Yaya Bello.
It's not emotional semanticism.
That's how you describe it, but that's not what it is. Anyway, but go ahead.
Lawmaking process is not emotional semantics. It is concrete, because you don't make law for a particular individual, you make laws for the nation. And in lawmaking process, you must follow duly laid down procedures. And anytime you fail to follow that duly laid down procedure, that law becomes invalid. Its concern is there. The argument is not whether the EFCC Establishment Act is an international United Nations Convention on anti-corruption. That's not the argument. Nobody is arguing that it is not so. Everybody is on the same page with that fact. And then if the fact remains that EFCC came after UNCAC convention, then why are we not domesticating it the way and manner we have told ourselves that we should domesticate? We should not run on the emotion that state governors will no longer be accountable. This constitution must always be respected by all. We have state judiciary. Is that if you say the EFCC must stay because you are afraid that the state governors will not, the state government will not establish similar anti-corruption agencies, then you can as well ask that the judiciary at the state level be scrapped. You can as well ask that the House of Assembly be scrapped so that everything becomes national. And in the wisdom of the Constitution, every federating unit has its own laid down procedures and principles of laws. So if EFCC is serving the interests of the federal government, the states can as well establish their own anti-corruption agencies. As a matter of fact, they have almost all states have similar agencies, even though they are not as loud as EFCC. And you now ask yourself, has EFCC been efficient?
States, not almost all states.
Is not serving the interest, if EFCC is not serving the interest of the federal government, why has EFCC never for once invited an ex-president for ordinary interaction, not to talk of interrogation or probe? Is it only the governors of the federating states that should be pulled over to account? Can presidents be pulled over to account? In South Africa, the former president of South Africa is serving a prison term. And in some other countries, former presidents can be called to give account, and when they fail to give account, they will be given the full length of the law. Is EFCC established to only catch governors? Why can it not catch presidents, ministers, and all agencies, heads of ministry, department, and agencies of the federal government? So it now seems and looks as if the EFCC is a tool in the hands of the federal government to harass, harangue, and intimidate state governors and the federating states. And that is why EFCC will have the boldness to break through the roof of a former governor just to go and apprehend him. So EFCC itself has not been law-abiding in its operations and in its programs. And that is why it has not achieved the set goals. Now we are now looking at the fact of its establishment. And I said earlier that it is never too late to do a detour. In the past, Nigeria was not confirming, the Senate was not confirming heads of military agencies, heads of chief of staff in the army, chief of air staff, and chief of defense staff, and chief of naval staff. But Mr. Festus Keyamo went to court and called the attention of the system that this is a breach of the provisions of the Armed Forces Act. And even after many years that we had been making that mistake, the Senate had to start confirming the heads of military agencies and military organizations. That is a very simple example of going the right track when you have discovered you have been on the wrong track. And there's nothing wrong with it. So there's nothing wrong with looking at the EFCC Establishment Act and then trying to establish it the very way and manner the Constitution provided. Anything short of that is a clear breach of the Constitution. It shows that the Act is inconsistent with provisions of the Constitution, and to the extent of its inconsistency, the Act should become invalid. And the invalidity is with respect to the federating units. We are not saying the EFCC will not serve the federal government. It can serve the federal government, but as presently constituted, it should have no business with the states and local governments.
I get your point. Unfortunately, we've lost Adewale Ajadi, and I think it's on that note we'll just have to end the discussion. We'll wait and see how the Supreme Court rules on this. However it goes, we all pray for the betterment of this country. Thank you very much, Fred Nzako, for coming on the program and sharing your time with us. Thanks a lot.
Many thanks.
Appreciate. I will take a short break and we'll be right back. Stay with us. Don't go away. Opinions are free. Facts are sacred, but truth is universal. How, in practical terms, can we, for instance, de-escalate the tension?
When you go into public office, you must be ready to answer to the people.
We know where the enemy is. 3 places. The Lake Chad Basin, the border area between Nigeria and Cameroon, and then the Sambisa Forest.
On DEJI360, we give you a complete dose of everything. Opinion, facts, and undiluted truth.
I hardly believe what politicians say in this part of the world. A new Nigeria is possible, a future is possible.
We delve into the issues, dissect it so that you can understand it, use it to take action.
I don't think there's any need for any governor to look for grant for ranching.
DEJI360, dissecting the issues.